Whatifalthist is a pseudo-intellectual with a video that is inconsistent, hypocritical, and immaterial. It should also be assumed that any part that wasn't included, I either didn't feel was relevant, was excluded due to my video length, was something I agreed with, or something I was not familiar with and decided to ignore. To start, Whatifalthist defines envy as
envy is the desire to tear down what others have. Not for any gain of yours, really, that's more jealousy. If your best friend is dating a really attractive, wonderful in every way girl and you want her, that's jealousy. If you want both of them to suffer at no gain to yourself since they have happiness that you can't experience, that's envy.
Perhaps the most important statement Whatifalthist makes that describes the intention and point of the video is this.
We don't seem to put together that in the same way we have to maintain the technological systems that hold up our modern society, like bridges, agricultural systems, and the like to keep them functioning, our social norms are the same. Without struggle and effort, human societies degrade back to base, disgusting norms.
It'll be important to hold this point in our minds. What exactly he is criticizing, what exactly he believes must be defended and maintained, and what exactly he considers disgusting degradation.
In the same way that technology has made our lives so much easier, so has social evolution. Over time, our societies have evolved towards greater and greater efficiency and less immorality and cruelty. For example, just look at how the Bronze Age governments would literally brag about how many of their opponents they butchered and how many of their own people they sacrificed to honor the deaths of their kings. However, over a multi-thousand-year period, those kinds of governments were continually outcompeted by kinder regimes that could pull on their population's loyalties.
He's making a subjective opinion that isn't as objective as he tries to make it. I disagree with him, which is also subjective, because I cannot see how atrocities of the past are any different from the things we see today. Some examples within the past 200 years are ongoing child labor, human trafficking, wars, famines, forced regime changes, and since the specific example of open torturing is listed, the US had its Guantanamo Bay torture camp and even openly admits to drone strikes against innocent people.
Let's start with where humans naturally evolved as hunter-gatherers. Among hunter-gatherer peoples, things are normally shared in the same way things are in a family or a group of friends. Since people were almost always in the move looking for food and resources, people didn't have a lot of possessions. However, that didn't mean these societies were equal. There were large inequities in the amount of sex people had, with 20 to 40% of the male population dying in war and youth, with the chieftain normally having half the women. This world was in a lot of ways zero-sum, unlike modern capitalism, and so envy evolved as a group hedge against single people doing outrageous stuff like accumulating all the seal meat in your lodge during a famine and charging your buddies for it. The group dare implicit in envy is something like, we'll burn your whole lodge including the seal meat down, so don't even think about trying it. Hunter-gatherer societies cared a lot about equality and not letting tyrant alpha males seize power. An example is among the Bushmen of South Africa, who, when a young man would make a great kill, will actively tell the young men they're worthless and low value so as not to let their egos get too big. Hunter-gatherer peoples will mock and socially outcast alpha males who try to seize total power over the tribe, finally killing them as a group.
Firstly, I don't find the use of a term coined by the observation of wolves in captivation, that is, alpha male, to be appropriate to describe people in primitive societies, nor is the most recent trend of toxic masculinity reinforcement something that existed back then. Secondly, it was in the material interest of those in primitive societies to work together communally, as they were unable to accumulate any surplus value. Hoarding food against others would have been unfathomable. So, the example Whatifalthist gives and his understanding of the primitive socio-economic system is incorrect. It is not that they cared about equality, nor out of envy, but that they worked to produce, within their means, the basic necessities to survive that required cooperation.
Something that always confused me in my personal life was why people were so scared of social pressure. I'm a person who's naturally wired to not care a lot about what others think about me, and I always found it confusing why in high school, for instance, trying hard at things and being earnest was looked down upon while it actually produced amazing results.
Whatifalthist speaks from a high horse, and I cannot see the relevance in making these statements if not for saying that people who fall to social pressures, who care about others' thoughts, and who do not take risks are inferior and envious. We cannot blame responsibility on such individuals. Without the proper training and knowledge of each person, we are completely oblivious to the conditional and psychological explanations behind who they are. with school being his example, saying that bullying is a form of envy would have made more sense, since it's a large cause of traumas, anxiety disorders, and even avoidant personality disorder, which can all cause people to fall to social pressures, worry about the thoughts of others, and withhold from taking risks. Lacking such an understanding and telling these people to just do like you do is like going up to a depressed person and telling them to just be happy.
Similarly, why people are so scared to try things that might fail, even if it costs them nothing but wasted effort and emotion, like starting a business or side hustle.
If all a person had to do to start a business was go to your city hall, tell them the business you wanted to make, and at no cost to you, get everything needed to start selling products, then I would agree. But that is not reality. For what if all this to not be aware of the difficulty of starting a business and the challenges many people face gives me the impression of class privilege and ignorance. The U.S. Small Business Administration says that micro businesses and home-based franchises cost around $3,000 to $5,000. Using older statistics, since COVID doesn't fairly represent what is normal, a survey conducted in 2017 by CareerBuilder found that 1 out of 10 of every worker who makes $100,000 or more lives paycheck to paycheck. 3 in 4 workers say they are in debt. More than half think they will always be in debt. More than half of minimum wage workers say that they have to work more than one job to make ends meet. 28% of workers making less than $99,000 almost always live paycheck to paycheck. 70% of those are in debt. 32% use a budget, out of which only 56% of budget savers save $100 or less a month. Blaming individual responsibility on those who can't start a business is shameful and neglects the conditional factors that most people are affected by. Those who budget still save little. Those with a better paying job need college. 1 in 4 Americans are in student debt, and those who don't get a degree still suffer.
Most humans are naturally conditioned to get along and undershoot their potential, since without the size of social hierarchies as they are now, there is simply less to gain from extreme risk-taking. From a genetic basis, the people who make up our current political, CEO, and leadership classes in general are insane genetic outliers that are wired to expend massive amounts of effort to succeed by basically gambling being disliked with massive success. In a hunter-gatherer community, the most success you could have is making a big bison kill. At the same time, not getting along with the group of people you would live with for your entire life would be very dangerous.
If Whatifalthist is saying that rich people compete fairly with everyone and just happened to have earned their positions of power and wealth through mere biological or psychological differences, then I have to point out the hypocrisy of blaming individual responsibility on the poor, but acknowledging supposed conditional factors for the rich. From the background, we can see these views come from Arnold Ludwig's King of the Mountain. I want to know why a psychiatrist who mostly studied LSD and alcohol tried to look into the psychology of rich people. However, I don't believe that the book is being understood correctly. University Press of Kentucky summarizes the book with this: people may choose to ignore their animal heritage by interpreting their behavior as divinely inspired, socially purposeful, or even self-serving, all of which they attribute to being human. But they masticate, fornicate, and procreate much as chimps and apes do. So, they should have little cause to get upset if they learn they act like other primates when they politically agitate, debate, abdicate, placate, and administrate too. Although humans and baboons may fight amongst themselves, dominate others, and keep harems, only humans have the ability to give pious excuses for what they do. Paranoia is naturally common among all kinds of rulers, especially tyrants and visionaries. End of quote. Telling me that people in power are often paranoid does not tell me that there is an inherited psychological difference between them and other people. All this tells me is that because we eat, shit, and fuck like monkeys, that we should ignore sociology, political science, and our human condition in order to justify the correlation. This is confirmed by the Washington Post book World's Review of King of the Mountain, which says, an Aristine book that casts political science out the window and explains leadership through comparisons with chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. When it's clear that it isn't about psychology, that it is completely disregarding political science, and when it's written by a person whose life work is dedicated to psychiatry and drug research, I do not believe that the King of the Mountain truly backs the points Whatifalthist is trying to make. But I am not done. Jeff Bezos is being referenced in an example. I'm not sure how getting $250,000 from family to start Amazon correlates to risk-taking or some sort of unique wiring in the brain. The reality is that most people are born poor, and some people are born into wealth. Jeff Bezos quit a job as senior vice president of D. Shaw Stock Trading Company. He was never going to be poor. It's no accident that many of the top oligarchs were born into extreme wealth or were from upper-class families with the means to start a business or survive if businesses fail. A more credible psychologist who has any study close to psychology in rich people is Lawrence R. Samuel. In Psychology Today, he identifies 5 types of rich people's psychologies after spending considerable time studying American wealth culture and documenting how rich people spend their time and money by using classic methods of cultural anthropology. Surely, if rich people were psychologically or neurologically wired differently, that this would have come up.
An interesting story here comes from Haiti, where if a person's walking along and sees their neighbor working in the field, they might ask, "What are you doing?" to which the reply would be, "Hardly working." This is since the neighbor saying working hard would suggest that they were judging the other person for not working. This is the norm across most cultures. Take the Navajo, who believe that if a person's happy and lives a good life, he must have taken that from the net happiness in the world, and so might be a wizard that's stealing good fortune from his neighbors.
None of this is true. I have no idea where Whatifalthist connected the expression's origins to Haiti. The expression is an English-specific chiasm, a wordplay on work and hard. There isn't even a correct way to answer the question, and Whatifalthist's false conclusion is definitely not the norm across most cultures. Instead, the context and conclusion are merely a pseudo-intellectual buildup given to call out some sort of invalid Western versus Eastern developmental comparison. Second, Whatifalthist claims that the Navajo believed that happiness was bad and that being successful meant you were a wizard stealing good fortune from the world. According to Springer Link, a site that provides researchers with access to millions of scientific documents, they have an article called Friendship and Happiness in Navajo. Here they say that friendship and happiness research on indigenous people of the USA, including Navajos, are scarce, as most of the scholarship orients on negative elements of their lives. I do not believe, then, that it is fair to make any claims about the Navajo's standings with happiness, or what type of happiness is being discussed, even if the claim statement about them is true. After all, the Greeks had multiple and differently defined types of love, and the concept of happiness is just as vague. Remember earlier when Whatifalthist talked about degradation and discussed happening if people don't maintain the social order? By declaring that Eastern and Third World cultures are the most envious, supported by his accusatory misunderstandings of customs and expressions, I believe it is safe to conclude that he finds Eastern and Third World countries disgusting and degrading societies. If the West is somehow better, is this also a subtle advocation for colonialism and imperialism, which was what pushed his so-called rule of law? I can't be the only one whose racist detection system is going off.
One of the things that's confused me across history is how stiflingly collectivist most of history's been. With the exception of the West for the last 1500 years, people in even very advanced societies like the Middle East, China, or India lived in clans with very little freedom. The top example of this is the caste system in India, which effectively ground the individual down with controlling every aspect of their lives between mate, occupation, and minor taboos they'd follow, which include how they live, dress, cook, allowing very little space for innovation. India is especially high in controlling the individual, but other societies have manifested similar systems. These extremely controlling collectivist societies are the norm since they mitigate envy and individual responsibility. If your arranged marriage sucks, that's your parents' problem, not yours, and you can keep telling yourself that. Most of human cultural history has been the attempt to shift blame away from the individual. When a person's life is controlled by countless little taboos and regulations, it means they can't succeed and so make everyone else feel bad.
It is completely inconsiderate and unfair to blame the Middle East, China, and India for the things being criticized. The British manipulated Buddhism, Islam, and Hinduism both in the Middle East and in India for the benefit of maintaining the colonies and dividing them from viewing Britain as the obvious scapegoat of their oppression. Great Britain, mind you, was obviously a Western empire. Under the British authority, both company and crown, the most fundamentalist and reactionary elements of religion were shuffled to the spotlight, including the mentioned caste system. The British also erased the concept of Shura councils, an Islamic concept that was deemed progressive for the time and had allowed the religion to adapt to modern conditions. Instead, the British codified Islamic law, and lastly with the Buddhists, the concept of Buddhist anarchism used to be very popular, but many Buddhist anarchists were severely prosecuted under British authority. Progressive elements of Hinduism, Islam, and Buddhism then were destroyed and manipulated, inspiring the prominent extremism we see to this day, like with the Hindutva, the Mujahideen, the Taliban, or like the genocidal Buddhists in Myanmar. Not only was Islam manipulated by the British West, but the Mujahideen were funded by the US, and the Taliban formed as a response to Western imperialism. India was completely denied its ability to prosper without Western intervention. Prior to British rule, India exported many highly valued commodities. Indian traders usually demanded gold and silver as payment during an era where much of Europe was extracting huge amounts of gold and silver from the Americas. A vast amount of this bullion ended up in India. Around the year 1700, India's share of the global economy was around 25%. Under British rule, India was deindustrialized. Its most profitable industries slumped to their lowest level from heavy taxation, high tariffs, and corruption that came with the British. According to historian Angus Maddison, by 1950, India's share of the global economy fell to 5%. I don't understand why the double standard, glorifying Western nations that greatly influenced, oppressed, and exploited the East, but not all Middle Eastern or Eastern nations were shut down. Why ignore the flourishing economies and innovations that came out of the Ottoman Empire or China? An opinion on China's use of gunpowder, compasses, and the like doesn't reflect the material basis that Eastern nations were indeed innovative.
Other civilizations were able to make massive technological advances, like China's invention of gunpowder, the printing press, paper, and compass, but never used them.
Additionally, primitive societies that Whatifalthist brought up earlier were full of innovations. How else did primitive people advance to slave societies, feudalism, and from that to capitalism? It was when rocks turned into tools, when animals were domesticated, and when language and writing were invented, that primitive societies were able to generate surplus value and allow it to advance into the societies we see today.
A free market is a representation of ultimate reality, and you're getting people things that they really want or need in the real world, and accruing benefit from it rather than purely pleasing emotions and whims. This means that the potential for gain if you get things right is extraordinary. The financial benefits accrued to the successful in capitalism has been unimaginably painful to people's senses of envy.
All you're getting from Whatifalthist is the on-paper idea that a free market is this good, fair, and mutual concept where everyone's able to provide for their needs. Seeing as how there was a previous advocacy for individual liberty, I think it's a fair guess to assume that Whatifalthist would consider the free market a free and liberating system. In practice, this is not the case. First off, it's immediately not liberating when you are born into a capitalist economy, only to realize the first things you need, like food, water, and shelter, are being hoarded, and you have no choice but to participate in the free market in order to acquire your basic needs to survive. Secondly, in order to get money to even participate in a market, you're also forced to engage in wage labor, a system where the value you produce is reaped from you and replaced with wages of significantly lesser value. The position of the capitalist is that of an autocrat. The job they do is not actually that significant and could be done by the workers themselves. Determining what to produce, how to produce it, and what the prices will be is nothing extremely difficult to justify the exploitation of the working class. In the background, You can read some more bootlicking from Whatifalthist, who pretends that Bill Gates and his tech company are something we should all be thankful for, as if the supposed innovations wouldn't have happened otherwise. But as we know, innovation is literally what got society to capitalism in the first place. We do not, in fact, need to be thankful for the exploitative practices and greed that Bill Gates engaged in. Having a state attorney for a father who gave Bill Gates easy access to university computers so that it can be him that created the company is also not a system of free and equal opportunity, only the opportunity to be born into wealth with the freedom to exploit people into the system you inherited. It is at this point where I found my brain cells decaying into a form of antimatter. Whatifalthist makes a desperate attempt to stretch many unrelated things in order to tie them into his opinions, in addition to ignoring historical context by just blaming everything on envy.
The West was able to suppress envy for the longest time, and with it came the massive technological, artistic, and social gains that went to that civilization.
All this says is he doesn't like modern art or social progress. But unlike right-wing show hosts like PragerU, who makes a 5-minute video on why modern art is bad, he stretches so far to make his opinions seem almost objective. Anyone with a bit of sense can tell he's being a pseudo-intellectual.
But, without noticing, the underlying structures that held down envy were weakening.
What underlying structures? This is so vague he might as well have not said anything. If he's so critical of envy, you'd think he'd include the exact structures that produce the conditions of it,
thus provoking tens of millions of deaths in the 20th century, driven almost entirely off envy.
Summing an entire century into this vague idea that everything within it happened because of envy is so absurd. This is what happens when you try to taint history with a metaphysical perspective, ignoring all the reasonings and conditions that led to events within an entire century, because no, it was envy.
The decline in traditional religions precipitated the rise in envy. It's interesting to see the word envy as a percentage of total words used precipitously decline from the 19th to 20th centuries. To chalk something up to envy was something acceptable in discourse a century ago, but now such things would be called victim blaming.
I found no connection in my research, historically, sociologically, or even psychologically, that suggests that envy and victim blaming are at all related. How is a victim questioning what they could have done differently in a traumatic event related to envy? How is a victim of a crime being partially or entirely held at fault for a crime at all related to envy? He doesn't know what victim blaming means, doesn't prove the claim, just says it, and provides no context or expansion on what he means by saying so.
You can clearly see that with the decline of Christianity in the Western world, socialism has risen. The countries that have remained the most Christian, like the United States and Poland, have largely remained the most capitalist, while the secular have become more socialist.
The Global Mission by Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary says that in 200 years, from 1800 to 2000, the world population increased more than 6 times, but the Christian population increased far faster over the same period, over 9 times. Even if Christianity was falling and socialism was rising, there's no evidence provided to suggest both occurrences are related. It's a false dichotomy. Socialism and Christianity are not opposites, and it wouldn't be oxymoronic to be a Christian socialist. We know that the quote Marx made about religion being the opium of the masses was an observation on how people sought comfort in religion in a similar way to those who sought comfort in opium, which was seen at the time as a legal, over-the-counter, cure-all drug. Many ignorant people mistake this for being anti-religious due to the opioid crisis that exists today, but many have not heard of his other quotes on Christianity.
The thing is that although European socialism has allowed a comfortable standard of living for the people with work, it's overall made Europe a lot poorer. In that Europe is the main part of the world that's seen active economic decline, with Europe going from 38% of the world's economy to 24% since the 1960s.
He acknowledges better living standards, but his concern is wealth he'll never have. This concept of poor and rich nations is really mind-boggling. A country like Cuba, which has some of the best education, some of the best healthcare, and extremely low homelessness, is still considered poor when America has a lower literacy rate than Cuba, has very expensive healthcare, and higher homelessness rates. The wealth Whatifalthist is concerned about is the type of wealth elites are concerned about. For the sake of time, the rest of the video will be summarized. He makes a baseless claim that intellectuals as a group are inherently envious, saying that they're smart but lack the grit or courage to become wealthy or powerful. but think they're better than those who are. Where he got this and how he defines this group is not provided. This leads up to saying that intellectuals support communism to take power and wealth away from the rich and powerful that they're supposedly so envious of. Assuming this is even true, isn't it a bit hypocritical to suggest that they lack grit or courage if they own up to their individual responsibility to take over? Nonetheless, he's also ignorant of what communism means and creating a straw man of those who are communist. Engels alone debunks all of this. Why is a man born into a wealthy family envious of his fellow elitists? Marx also debunks this alone, but it is not as obvious since it takes a lot of reading to discover. When you do the reading, it's clear he criticizes capitalism for its flaws, alienation, and exploitation, not out of envy. If anything, Whatifalthist should be praising Karl Marx. He didn't just complain about the system, but he took it into his own initiative by actually developing theories against it and partaking in efforts to change it. A simple quote from Gilles Duhav's Capitalism and Communism book can debunk this as well. He says in a quote, "If one identifies proletarian with manual labor or with the poor, one misses what is subversive in the proletarian condition. It is not the collection of the poor, but of those who are dispossessed. Indeed, most proles are low paid. Yet their existence as proletarians derives not from being low-paid producers, but from being cut off, alienated, with no control either over their lives or the outcome and meaning of what they have to do to earn a living. The bourgeoisie, on the other hand, are ruling class, not because they're rich and the rest of the population are not. Being bourgeois brings them riches, not the other way around. They are ruling class because they control the economy, employees as well as machines. Individual ownership, strictly speaking, is only a form of class domination in particular variants of capitalism. If the proletarians were just a couple of billion dispossessed people, defined by what they are not, have not, and do not, how could such an infinite but entirely negative mass achieve anything positive?" End of quote. At this point, it is clear that communists, the proletariat, are people who are dissatisfied with the current system and out of willpower and strength, not envy, seek to improve their situation by organizing themselves to go beyond capitalism and ending the conditions of their exploitation and alienation for good. In the background, he says some very inconsiderate and dehumanizing things about people who can't hold a job, who resort to crime, and who resort to drugs. Regardless of anyone's opinions of Stalin, Castro, or Mao, Whatifalthist is criticizing them for being affected by things that I feel like most human beings can relate to or know someone who has been through such. I don't even need to verify the claims, since it doesn't matter if they did these things or not, though I do know that Stalin robbed banks to fund the Bolshevik Party. Even that is besides the point. It just further validates the hunch I had of how privileged Whatifalthist is. How dare people beg until they can get back on their feet again? Nor can everyone hold a job. Psychologically, neurodivergents such as people with ADHD or autism often struggle to hold a job for a living in a world made for neurotypicals. People with personality disorders, anxiety disorders, psychotic disorders, and phobias also struggle to hold a job, which certainly isn't their fault. It can be difficult to discover these things about yourself, especially in places or during times where psychological knowledge isn't updated or available. Drug abuse is also a common trait of the aforementioned psychological factors, including substance abuse disorder and addictive personality disorder. Drug abuse is a coping mechanism, and sometimes it's the best one someone has. Conditional factors are ignored as well. Not everyone can connect to the job market, explain long periods of employment, be qualified for the available jobs, or be treated equally and not discriminated against. None of the stuff I just explained solely applies to intellectuals either.
Communism as it exists today doesn't make sense with any other prism except envy. It's been routinely shown to make people poorer and has failed at every single attempt on every continent and every civilization. If we were using the scientific method for the costs incurred, communism has clearly been a failed experiment.
Has it?
Hello. You've probably seen this study around, Economic Development, Political Economic System, and the Physical Quality of Life by Saraceto and Waitskin. The study empirically shows that under equal levels of development, socialist countries consistently scored higher on quality of life based on actual life indicators: access to healthcare, education, employment, minority rights, nutritional intake, etc.
Finally, in part 5 about social justice and envy, Whatifalthist misrepresents the fat body positive movement. He claims that society shames those who find thin fit girls beautiful, but nobody says that. It's simply a movement seeking more representation for body types that have been neglected and break traditional beauty standards. Body shaming is just downright assholery. When it comes to women, almost always misogynistic. No one should tell others what to do or how to be, even if you think it's unhealthy. For one, it's not your life. And two, telling people they are too skinny or too fat doesn't change anything. Why not criticize things like the affordability of fast food instead? Body shaming affects people's well-being, projects insecurities, and can cause disorders that lead to undereating, overeating, anxiety, and depression. Why does the simple and positive request to ask for more representation of all types have to be seen purely as envious?
If you look at social justice, it exists to tear down any inequity, whether that between men and women, different ethnic groups, fat and thin, rich and poor, successful and unsuccessful nations around the world, saying all of it must be driven by oppression. It ignores that every single category of anything across history and geography is naturally deeply unequal. Similarly, it views success as zero-sum in that the oppressors must stop oppressing, rather than the unsuccessful should find things to emulate in the successful. This is the dictionary definition of an envious viewpoint.
He claims that all social justice says that all inequalities are driven by oppression, once again providing no evidence for such. In the background, he talks about random inequality with the example of how most mountains are in Asia, which makes me believe he sees oppression as natural. I just want to know when he will start talking about skull shapes to justify oppression against non-whites. Social justice is just that. It's regarding justice that is social. Race, gender, sexuality, and economics are all social constructs, just like language, culture, and art. And like language, culture, and art, race, gender, sexuality, and economics are all subject to change and evolve. It's not idealistic or immaterial to recognize oppressions and seek to change them. The icing on this god-awful cake is that he says,
Youth culture today is literally about being an antisocial, sociopathic degenerate.
How ableist. It doesn't matter if Whatifalthist is an empath or not, neurotypical or neurodivergent, nor does it matter if he has antisocial personality disorder or is a sociopath himself. You don't get to further perpetuate misinformation and stigmas against antisocial and sociopathic people. Using the term degenerate shows that he is trying to use these psychological terms as an insult and finds it suitable to put degenerate in the same context. All of this is because he simply doesn't understand progressive society. It's him who needs to catch up, not the youth that needs to slow down. If he wants to criticize rappers who glorify violence, pretty sure many leftists would agree with that. If he wants to criticize people who overuse the term fascist, don't forget to mention how ignorant right-wingers think that everything slightly progressive is radical and communist, and that those who think that anti-fascists are the real fascists. But none of that justifies calling those who glorify violence or overuse the term fascist antisocial degenerates, nor is criticizing those who disrespect their elders sociopathic degenerates. But of course, all people should be respected. That doesn't mean we should support an elder's authority unquestioningly and believe everything they say based on assumed experience. It's valid that many have a low tolerance for old people who are stereotypically known to be horse pill-taking, red scare brainwashed, stubborn homophobes, transphobes, and racists. And finally, criticizing drug abusers, as we already mentioned, is fairly privileged, unfair, and inconsiderate. But if you really want to help people who abuse drugs, calling them degenerate does not solve the problem. If the left are snowflakes, then what is Whatifalthist for being butthurt over people who chill and party? I'd also like to know who said partying is rebellion. Did no one invite this dude to any?
We should also view the hatred of historical figures as an envy for the past. In real objective terms, what has our generation accomplished in comparison to our forefathers? They won the world wars, ended disease and real grinding poverty, reached the moon, ended slavery, did actual legal changes to deal with discrimination, tamed thousands of miles of wilderness and beat tyrannies. When we tear down the statues of figures like Churchill, write histories without dead white males, or cut Shakespeare out of the curriculum, we enviously destroy their memories so that we don't have to think about them and how we don't hold up.
Before being put out of our misery with this video, Whatifalthist rants about those who cancel and want to support the destruction of statues like that of Churchill. History is indeed important, but we can put history in books and on internet articles. We don't need statues of terrible people. Churchill might have helped defeat Nazi Germany, but he also continued the Bengal famine and was very racist and is a symbol of that. People who are worried about a cancel culture are the kind who don't want their favorite homophobic, transphobic, and racist celebrities being criticized for it as they should be.
Martin Luther King's message of judging people as individuals for their moral value rather than judging them for their group identity like the rich, the Jews, etc. is the way forward.
To those who are still here, I thank you, incredibly, for sticking with me. To conclude, Whatifalthist considers himself a history buff, yet this video says otherwise. This has to be the worst video I've ever seen from him, and I don't know anyone that actually appreciates history and materialism could still see Whatifalthist the same. It doesn't matter if you're a right-winger or a left-winger, this video is full of many baseless claims, hypocrisies, and inconsistencies. A lot of it was an attempt to disguise his opinions and feelings as factual, with desperate attempts to tie it all together with other pseudo-intellectual arguments and historical misunderstandings. Lastly, in this video alone, Whatifalthist has proven himself to be a bootlicker, racist, body-shaming, and ableist person. The East does not lack innovation. The West is not any better. Socialists are not envious for criticizing the system they're discontent with. Christianity is not in opposition to socialism, and body shaming is not about hating on those who like skinny people, nor is it envious. This has been Whatifalthist Debunked on Envy. If you liked this video or learned something new, leave a like. If you didn't, then leave a dislike. Subscribe for more content like this.